Some centuries after Aquinas, another English philosopher named Samuel Clarke had a very short, very terse, but beautiful reinterpretation of Aquinas' argument that seems to be an improvement on it. To understand where Clarke is coming from, it helps to know that he distinguished between two different concepts. He gave a definition of a dependent being, whereas a dependent being is a being that has the reasons for its existence outside of itself. Very abstract notion. Just about everything that you've ever come across, probably, is a dependent being. I'm a dependent being because my existence is due to that of my parents and, I guess, the food I eat and the air that I breathe and so forth. The Empire State Building is a dependent being. The planet Mercury is a dependent being, and so on and so forth. As long as the thing has a reason for its existence outside of itself, it's a dependent being, firstly. By contrast, Clarke defines an independent being as you might imagine, a being that has the reason for its existence inside of itself. Now, we're not assuming that there are any independent beings yet. Just as I give you the definition of a flimp as a 17-headed reptile and leave open the question whether or not there are any flimps on this planet, or any planet for that matter, so too I can define the concept of an independent being as something that has the reasons for its existence inside of itself, and we can still be neutral on the question for now whether or not there are any independent beings. But it's helpful for understanding Clarke to distinguish between these two concepts, and then we'll see what he's able to do with them. Okay, now he's going to try to show, intuitively that is going to be, Clarke will try to show that the universe cannot be only an infinite causal regression of dependent beings. That's a mouthful, so I'll say it again. Clarke is going to try to show that even if the universe contains an infinite causal regression of dependent beings, it couldn't contain just that. It would also have to contain at least one independent being as well. So, Clarke has no problem with the idea of an infinite causal regression, or more precisely, an infinite causal regression of dependent beings. But he wants to argue that this couldn't be all that there is. If there's that, what's called an ICRDB, infinite causal regression of dependent beings, then there must be something else as well. He's also going to use the idea of the strategy known as reductio ad absurdum, which is Latin for reduced to absurdity. Some arguments in which you try to establish a conclusion proceed by showing that some proposition P implies an absurdity. So here's a simple reductio ad absurdum argument. Suppose somebody told you, one of your friends tells you that she and her other buddies just got together and they counted to the largest integer. You could show them that that's an absurd idea, that their claim must be wrong, because you could argue as follows. Well, suppose that the integer you just counted to is n. Well, I've got a larger integer for you, namely n plus 1. So your supposition that the integer that you counted to is the largest integer must reduce to absurdity, because you're assuming that it's the largest, but I can also show that n plus 1, by definition, must be larger than it. So that would show your friend must be mistaken in thinking that she and her buddies were able to count to the largest integer. So too, Clarke is going to try to argue that the supposition that the universe is nothing but an infinite causal regression of dependent beings, that supposition reduces to absurdity and therefore must be false. Here goes. This will be a slightly more complicated argument than the ones we've seen so far. Suppose that the universe, premise 1, suppose that the universe is nothing but an infinite causal regression of dependent beings. He's going to suppose this in the way that I supposed that n is the largest integer. Suppose it in order to reduce it to absurdity. Suppose that 1 is true. Well, this, for short, ICRDB, has to have the reasons for its existence either inside of itself or outside of itself. That is, Clarke is asking, this whole series, this whole ICRDB, where did it come from? What is its source? Clarke, the source is either outside the series or inside the series. Well, but wait, it can't be outside the series, because we're assuming, as from premise 1, that the universe is nothing but this ICRDB. So there's nothing else besides the ICRDB inside this universe. Therefore, the cause of the ICRDB cannot be inside the ICRDB itself. It would have to be inside instead. But wait, the ICRDB is nothing but dependent beings. But no dependent being in the series can explain the entire series. Think of the series as like a stream. something in the stream might be able to explain what is downstream from it, but couldn't explain what's upstream from it. So anything that you try to cite within the series itself could at most explain some subsequent events in the series, but not any prior events in the series. So our supposition that the universe is nothing but an ICRDB must be untrue. It reduces to absurdity. Because if the universe were nothing but an ICRDB, then it couldn't have an explanation for its existence outside of itself. It couldn't have an explanation for its existence inside of itself, because the only things that are inside the series are other dependent beings, which can only explain things that are subsequent to them, nothing that are prior to them. And therefore, our supposition that the universe is nothing but a series of dependent beings must be untrue. And so the universe is either a finite causal regression of dependent beings, in which case you'd have to have a first cause, or there's at least one independent being, which has, by definition, the reasons for its existence inside of itself. Clark argues that he doesn't think that by itself proves the existence of a GCB, but he thinks he's made some headway. He thinks he's made some progress along that path. He thinks he can give us some reasons in the direction of theism by saying, even if the universe contains an infinite causal regression of dependent beings, it must also contain something else, something very special and unusual, namely something that has the reason for its existence inside of itself. And as you can imagine, the idea of something that's got the reason for its existence inside of itself must be pretty special. And you can see why Clark would have thought that if you can establish at least one independent being, he's at least on the way towards proving the existence of a GCB.